This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 60 of Here's How. We're nearly a decade down the road from the economic crisis, but its effects are still being felt, and now many people are trying to reverse those effects. In this podcast, I'll be talking to a union leader about what he calls pay restoration.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Normally when I do my little editorial piece, I put it here, but in this case, I've put it to the end. You will understand when you hear it. But I want to take a moment to tell you about one new thing on the podcast. I'm sure you know that you can subscribe on iTunes or any other podcast client, but a lot of people just listen with the player on the website. So for them, I've put a new feature on. You can just enter your email address and you'll get an alert each time a new podcast goes up. I promise it won't be used for anything else. You'll just get a simple email with a link to click and listen to each new podcast. So if you do listen on the website, please do subscribe to that.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line now, I have Tom Geraghty. He is the General Secretary of the Public Service Executive Union. First of all, Tom, what sort of people do you represent?
Well, we represent about 10,000 people in junior and middle management grades in the civil service and in some state organisations.
Okay, you had your annual conference recently and you were calling for, I think you called it pay restoration. Tell me what you meant by that.
Well, in 2009-2010, the then government cut the income of public servants, some of it in the form of a so-called pension levy, and some of it in the form of just straightforward pay cuts. The effect of that was to reduce the pay on average of public servants by about 13.5%. This, of course, was in addition to the impositions on the rest of the citizens, which were
extra
also
taxation
applied to public servants. Yes. And the basis on which those cuts were made was that there was a financial or fiscal emergency, and the legislation that gave effect to those cuts was described indeed as the financial emergency measures in the public interest legislation, or so-called FEMPI. The emergency is clearly over. And therefore what we were saying is that the time had come to restore the cuts that had been imposed at that time.
One thing about that, you're correct that it was called an emergency and that there was an enormous, I've got the figures in front of me, there was an enormous hole opened up in the public finances whereby there was a crash in tax revenue and a levelling off. It didn't decrease, but it stopped increasing quite so quickly in public expenditures, and there was a huge amount of debt built up, of public debt built up at that time, and on top of that there was the cost of the banking bailout. But I've actually looked at the figures, and the cost of the deficit, that's to say how much the government was spending more than it could collect in tax, was actually significantly larger than the bank bailout. Isn't it true that part of the emergency, as it was called, was caused by too much public expenditure, a too fast rise in the cost of what the government was spending, particularly wages?
Well, I would say that the deficit, and there isn't any doubt that there was a fiscal deficit when, in fact, our fiscal position collapsed in late 2008, early 2009. But that was caused primarily because, in fact, rather than to really an increase in expenditure. I would argue that the problem actually lay in the other direction, that we narrowed our tax base significantly, and quite frankly, I would say somewhat absurdly, and we became over-dependent on taxes that were related to property transactions. And as soon as the property bubble burst, there was an immediate and significant consequence for tax revenues, and that's what caused the fiscal deficit. I mean,
I would agree with you. I'd agree with you 100%, Tom. That was a really bad idea to concentrate, to rely so heavily, and especially rely on for current spending on what was essentially capital income, the once-off income on, for example, taxation on housing that was clearly not going to continue. But the way that those very fast increases that we had in the early 2000s, those very fast increases in public sector pay were funded with that.
Yes, that's true, but I think you need to put that into the context of the time. I mean, what actually? I mean, there's been an awful lot of, I suppose, inevitably when there's a recession, there's a blame game goes on, and there are people looking to scapegoat certain sectors of the community. And that unfortunately is what happened in relation to public servants after 2009. And a lot of the commentary was around, benchmarking was a disaster and so on and so forth. But in fact, if you go back and you look at what happened at the time, benchmarking was simply an attempt to try and ensure that the growth in public service salary levels kept pace with the growth that was taking place in private sector.
To roll back there, Tom, and I've looked at the figures. In almost every single year, the inflation in public sector wages was higher than the inflation in private sector wages.
Well, actually, that may very well be true in some sort of general sense, but the benchmarking process, what it did was it looked at the particular jobs that people did in the public service and made comparisons with the same jobs that are jobs of equal value in the private sector. And in the first benchmarking report, which came out in the early noughties, it found that there was a significant gap, that the private sector wage levels were on that basis running way ahead of the public service. And the problem, in fact, and the reason the employer was interested in addressing it, is they were struggling to recruit people into the public service at the time, because for the very obvious reason that it was much more attractive to go into the private sector. Now, the second benchmarking report, which came out in 2007, which received very little commentary, actually found that as a consequence of the first benchmarking exercise, that the gap between the public service and the growth in private sector pay levels had largely closed. And as a consequence, the second benchmarking report made very minimal recommendations, and only in respect of a small number of categories within the public service.
Tom, you're probably correct in to say, and certainly private sector people in private sector employers in the 2004, 5, 6 had great difficulty in recruiting in the same way that the public sector did. But the methods used in the benchmarking were also certainly done with an eye to getting governments re-elected. And I forget who it was who said, "He who defends everything defends nothing." Would you concede that some of what went on was unjustified from an economic point of view and was really just vote buying?
No, I wouldn't.
None at all.
Well, sorry. I mean, I would. I don't need to concede, because I wasn't responsible for what was done to our fiscal base.
For the purpose of argument.
That was a problem. That was a problem that was created by governments generating unrealistic expectations about what could be done on the taxation side. But on the expenditure side, in relation to pay, I don't believe that the government at the time had any choice but to try and realign public service pay levels with what was happening in the private sector, because they were, as a matter of fact, struggling to get people to apply for jobs in the public sector.
That was true in every sector.
Well, it undoubtedly, the growth in salaries was partially due to the fact that there was, as they described it, a tight labour market. In other words, it was difficult to get people because there were a lot of jobs and a lot of perhaps not as many applicants for the jobs at the particular time. So inevitably, there was a consequence for wages. But the effect of that then was that private sector wage levels were rising, and in
but
the
not
comparable
as
jobs.
fast, not as
no,
fast.
we see, you keep missing the point I'm making. What the benchmarking exercise did in the first instance was it looked at what the particular jobs that people did in the public service, and it tried to find similar jobs or jobs of equal value in the private sector, and it made a direct like-for-like comparison on a grade-by-grade, category-by-category basis. Now,
but the accusation and the suspicion amongst people in the private sector was that those comparisons were fudged, and that there wasn't a valid comparison of work rates and skills, and can I just make one point? And for example, for the report that we saw on the various allowances, nobody in the private sector would dream of asking for an allowance to change the toner in their cartridge in their printer. And don't you accept that people in the private sector were genuinely angered to find out that the salaries as measured were excluding bonuses like that?
Okay, well, you've conflated a number of points, if you may say so. So just allow me a bit of time to respond. The first thing is I don't ever subscribe to conspiracy theories. So I can absolutely assure you, somebody who was charged at the time with trying to make a case to the benchmarking body, there was no conspiracy to inflate public service pay. We had to sweat hard to try and prove our case, as you would expect before any third party. That's what happens when third parties deal with public service pay, and indeed deals with industrial relations generally. In that particular instance, it was simply a fact, and there's no getting away. It was a fact that public service wage levels were falling behind the growth in private sector levels, and it was
hang on a second. The levels or the growth?
Well, it doesn't actually matter, but it was both, in fact. But it doesn't actually matter because I tell you why.
The CSO figures would say that when allowing for age, hours worked, and skill and experience levels, the public sector has always had enjoyed a public sector bonus, and in those years that bonus widened considerably. And if you go to continental Europe, for example, there is a differential in pay rates between the public sector and the private sector, and the public sector earnings are significantly lower, and it is seen as a trade-off between the level of job security and the level of wages. In Ireland, the public sector seems to get obviously they got much better job security, and they also have higher wages.
Two assumptions in your question there, and both of them are incorrect. It is not the case on a European level that public service wages lag behind the private sector. Invariably, it reflects the similar situation to what we have here, that if you do the crude exercise that you're talking about, where you simply look at the number of people in one sector and the overall wage cost, and you divide it by the number of people in that sector.
About the crude exercise. I'm talking about making allowance for experience, for levels of education and so forth.
Yes, and when you make, it's more than that actually now, to be honest. I mean, if you look at the public service, you don't have the two parts of our economy that are the lowest in terms of salary, and that's retail and hospitality. So immediately, if you're doing an average across the two sectors, the two lowest paid sectors are excluded in the public service, so you would expect there is always going to be a higher average, broad general average, inevitably as a consequence.
Sure, but it's possible to adjust for that.
Indeed, and the CSO's most recent report did adjust for factors such as that, did adjust for educational qualifications, and did adjust for length of service and age, and has found that the public service has in fact fallen behind in terms of income, has fallen behind the private sector, which, by the way, is wildly out of line with what happens right across Europe. Because of the factors that I've mentioned, public service pay, in a broad general average, tend to be ahead. Now, I want to finish this point because I want to put this to bed once and for all. Those surveys are of very limited value. if I went in before an industrial relations third party in the morning with the most recent CSO survey, which shows that public service pay levels have fallen in some sort of general way, fallen behind the pay levels in the private sector, the third party, be it the Labour Court or an arbitration board, would say to me, so what? Because if I go into an industrial relations third party, they are going to ask me to do what the benchmarking body did in the early noughties. They're going to ask me, if I'm going to make a comparison, to do it on a strict like-for-like basis. In other words, that if I'm representing a group or a category, that I find a group or a category in the private sector that is doing like work or work of equal value, and I will make a comparison between the pay rates of the two. And if I try to go in with broad, generalised averages, such as the sort of surveys that we're talking about, I'd be told that's very interesting, but it's completely irrelevant. And unfortunately, in the public discourse that took place, the blame game, as it were, after 2009, it suited commentators who wanted to heap blame on public service pay levels as if somehow they magically had created their fiscal difficulties, to emphasise these broad, generalised surveys, which, to be blunt about it, even the most recent CSO survey, which suits the argument that I'm making to you now, is of very, very limited value.
Oh, okay, well, let's put that aside for a moment. And I don't think we're going to agree on that, and I will try to put in some notes for this podcast, some figures for reference so that people can look at them themselves if they want. But looking at work rates specifically, and I've worked pretty much all my life in the private sector, but I've had a huge amount of interaction because of the work that I do with the public sector. And for some of so I know the public sector very well, and for some of the reasons I would definitely not be attracted to working in the public sector, most typically around the way of social interaction and perhaps not always bullying, but I think that people in the public sector sometimes have a tough time. But and I'm sure you as a union, are experienced at trying to resolve those situations.
Sure.
But in many cases, in the private sector, if some of the examples of bullying that I've seen in the public sector occurred, any manager worth their salt would call in the 2 or 3 or however many people involved and would in 5 minutes say, sort it out or you're at the door. And we've seen cases, for example, in the National Museum of these things going on for years. We've seen examples of gardaí suspended from duty on pay for 7 years. We've seen also very, very poor work rates. For example, when the MABS, the money advice and budgeting service that the government runs, if you work in a private sector call centre of any of the dozens that are around the country, you will have very clear targets of how many calls you need to answer per day, and depending on the level of complexity, that might be somewhere between 20 and 50 or even 100 calls a day if it's a fairly simple task. The MABS was dealing with, each employee was dealing with 1 or 2 new clients per week. And that's just mind-boggling for some people in the private sector. Can you accept that there's an entirely different culture of work rates in most places? I would not, and I think perhaps it might be wrong to say the private sector, but the competitive sector, that maybe in the past 20 or 30 years with multinationals coming into Ireland, they've brought in very, very modern management practices that the public sector simply hasn't moved at anything like the same speed.
It's a very long question, William, but the short answer to it is no. I don't accept it.
You don't accept
I don't accept that the central proposition that you're putting forward there is that there is somehow less of a work ethic in the public service. First of all, I would say to you that's an extraordinary generalisation when you're talking about 300,000 public servants. Of course, there may be individual instances where people don't work to maximum performance. I suspect that happens in the private sector as well.
Can you imagine anybody being suspended on pay for 7 years in any competitive company in the competitive sector?
Well, I think, look, I'm not going to comment. I'm not aware personally of a case of somebody being suspended for 7 years, and even if I was, I'd be very, very careful not to comment about something in which there may be individual characteristics that mark it out as distinctive from other instances. So I think if you want to deal with this in the round, the proposition that you're attempting to put to me is that somehow there's a different work ethic, and that I would categorically say is not the case. I have represented people in all sectors in the course of my lifetime, and people don't change, William. People, there are people who have strong work ethic. There are others who have less of a work ethic. There are people who are prepared to go the extra mile, and there are other people, and it has nothing to do with the sector in which they work.
Sure, but people respond. Hold on a second, Tom. People respond to motivation.
Indeed, they do.
And I don't want to impugn anybody working in the public sector. I absolutely agree with your point. I think that, people are people, and it's certainly not the case that people of lesser moral or working quality are recruited to one sector or the other. But there is an effect that essentially when you can fire your boss's boss through the ballot box, then your boss doesn't have quite as much power over you.
Well, I don't accept that there's widespread evidence of that at all. I mean, I'm quite sure that if I was to kind of go through instances of situations that are arisen in the private sector, I could match the 2 or 3 examples that you want to give to me, and I'm not saying whether they're valid or not. I don't know enough about them, but I'm quite sure that I could do the same for the private sector. I mean, the truth of the matter is that the public service is an enormous range of different organisations.
I don't think you could match it, because if there was a company where the staff were incredibly unproductive, they would go out of business. So those staff would essentially punish themselves, and that's not something that happens in the public sector.
I'm in serious danger of getting drawn into this rather stupid argument about private versus public, which I want to avoid. I mean, all I will say is that if you want to generalise about these things, look at what happened in the financial services sector. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, that's hardly a paragon. It was hardly a paragon of virtue or an example, and that was exclusively in the private sector. Does that mean that everybody in the private sector should be tarnished with that brush? Of course not. It's ridiculous.
Well, let me tell you a lesson.
If I may say so, is absurd. For precisely that reason.
I would gain from that the banks sensed and worked out correctly, as it turned out, that it didn't matter what risks they took, because the government would essentially bail them out. And when somebody is working in a position that success or failure at the end of the day won't matter, then they're not quite so motivated.
But success does matter. It matters in every sector. I mean, first of all, I have always been of the belief, and this is something that I'm on record as saying about the bonus culture that we had in the private sector. People are largely motivated to do a good job because they're self-motivated to do a good job. I mean, and that is true of any sector. People, by and large, everybody who goes to work, there are exceptions, but there are exceptions in all sectors. By and large, people who go to work want to do a good job. It doesn't matter where they work. And this kind of proposition that there's something different about people in the public service, it's actually quite offensive, to be honest with you. And I mean, and public servants get very hurt by it, because it suggests that they're somehow, parasites on the back of the rest of the population. Whereas in fact, the vast overwhelming bulk of them go to work and try to work as hard as they possibly can, largely as with people in the private sector, to get some satisfaction out of their daily job.
You don't want to. Do you understand that there's a bit of a difficulty there? You don't want to deal in generalizations, and you don't want to comment on specific cases. But one that I've just found up here, in 2009, not surprisingly, because the MABS, the Money Advice and Budgeting Service, was dealing with a lot of people who were broke, essentially. They were allocated new staff by the Department of Social and Family Affairs. It was about 1 month later that the work rates were published, and they deal with an average of about 2 new clients per employee per week. That's a work rate that would be unheard of in the competitive sector.
Okay, well, William, I suggest you put that question to somebody who looks after people who work in the MABS, rather than try and use it as a basis to smear.
I'm not smearing anyone. I'm asking you questions. Hold on for a second, Tom. I'm asking you questions, and I haven't done anything other than quote facts at you and ask you to explain.
No, but hold on. I mean, you're taking. I don't know how many people are employed by MABS. It's a small, very small organisation as far as I know. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if there's a problem there that needs to be addressed, well, then you maybe address that question to them. There are 300,000 people work in the public service. I mean, it is just unfair to suggest that because there's a problem in some place that all of those 300,000 people should be regarded as shirkers, or somehow that they're less productive than everybody else. It's both unfair and it's absolutely untrue. And it has the public discourse since 2009 has quite frankly been very ugly, as people have sought to find scapegoats, and a convenient scapegoat for a lot of people was their neighbours, their family members, and people that they know who work in the public service. And it was absolutely, quite frankly, ridiculous. And I mean, you said to me there a moment ago that it was difficult when I didn't want to deal in generalisations or particular cases. I actually don't want to be having that conversation at all, because it's absurd. It's frankly absurd. It's because it suggests that there's something uniquely different about people who work in the public service. And I mean,
no, it doesn't. It suggests that they're the same, that if they are not put under pressure to work at a particular rate, that they won't. And that's true of every human being everywhere. And I think what some people in the private sector would resent is that they see every year, essentially, the pace is being stepped up. If you look at, for example, insurance companies or somebody who works in a call center, something like that, they will have new work techniques, maybe new technology be brought in, and every single ounce of that advance is squeezed out as increased productivity rates, and they feel that that's not happening in the public sector.
Well, let me tell you, the public sector hasn't stood still. The public sector is, in fact, in many parts of the public sector, is at the cutting edge of new technology, and always has been and has to be. I mean, because they have to adapt their systems to the changing requirements and the changing availability of resources. I mean, we had a situation since 2009
Wait, roll back a second. Did you say that the public sector is at the cutting edge of new technology?
I said that it has been in certain areas at different times. I mean, again, you see, there's this great risk that I say something and say, he's just said something
I'm just
about the entire
what you're
public
saying.
sector.
I'm clarifying what you're saying, Tom. I want to be fair, and I want to ask you questions, and you will accept that I'm giving you full range to answer your question.
I remember the very first time I ever heard of a system that we now know to be an intranet system was in the Department of Social Welfare more than 25 years ago, because they made a substantial investment in new technology to deal with the spike in unemployment figures that they had at that time. And that was very much at the cutting edge of new technology at the time, and it required complete changes in working practices and so on. That's the sort of ongoing change that happens in every organisation. If it's to survive, and it doesn't matter whether it's in the public or the private sector. Organisations, if they are to survive, have to adapt to changing circumstances. And there are occasions but just let me finish this point. I keep trying to make points, and you keep interrupting me. An organisation has to respond to challenges, and when the challenges are greater, as for instance, just following on from that example, they were in the Department of Social Welfare at that time. Well, then obviously that's when the organisation has to look to make the greatest amount of change to deal with those changed circumstances. And that's true of the private sector as well. In the private sector, you go out of business if you don't adapt and change. In the public sector, if you don't adapt and change, then you create difficulties for the people you serve, and that generates its own problems. Actually, the public service organisations frequently morph into different organisations and so on.
How many redundancies were made?
If you're going to start measuring productivity on the basis of people getting sacked,
let me address exactly what you're saying. Let me address your point exactly, Tom.
Beyond the absurd at this point.
Okay, well, let me address exactly that point. And there were many companies that in the recession that cut back drastically because their level of business dropped dramatically.
Yes, and the public service cut its numbers by close to 40,000
Okay. Well, one example specifically, because I know it well, in a particular, and I know it in Kildare, the number of planning applications fell away almost to zero. Mm-hmm. There had been huge increases in the staffing of planning offices in local authorities during the boom, and that was at least partly justified by the increase in activity. There were no redundancies when the level of work fell away to zero. Mm-hmm. The people in the private sector see that and resent it very deeply. Now, I think, I can't remember who made the comment recently that when ordinary people are fighting each other, it's the bosses who are laughing. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But people also can perceive very acutely, unfairness, and that really does feel unfair.
Okay, but let me respond, and please give me the time to respond on this, okay? I don't know anything about the specific case of the planning office, but what I will tell you is in relation to redundancies. We made two agreements in the course of the recession, the Crow Park Agreement and the Haddington Road Agreement. Mm-hmm. Both of them involved us having to bite our tongues and live with pay cuts, right? We just had to accept it.
These were the agreements with the Fianna Fáil government.
Sorry?
These were the agreements with the Fianna Fáil government.
No, the second one was with the Fine Gael
government. Nevertheless, they were agreements to have pay cuts instead of job cuts.
They were agreements that we would live with the pay cuts. That we didn't agree to the pay cuts, but we lived with the pay cuts in return for protecting jobs in the public service. Because we wanted, and I think anybody, whatever sector they're out there, would accept this, that when times are difficult, the priority has to be to protect people's employment. And we made agreements that there would be no compulsory redundancy in the public service. But in order for that to be met, we had to agree that people could simply be redeployed around the public service, so that somebody who worked in, I don't know, a library, if the library was being closed down or if the staff were being reduced, they could be redeployed to work in a government department somewhere else, right? And that involved, obviously, as you would imagine, a significant amount of disruption for an awful lot of individuals. But
can you understand, Tom, how people
protect their jobs?
But can you understand, Tom, how people in the private sector take that all the time? That's just a standard practice. If your job role is no longer needed, you have two choices. You're either made redundant or you're redeployed, and most frequently you get nothing at all for it.
And that was the choice that faced public servants in the circumstances of the recession. And we stepped up to the plate. We lived with the fact, with great difficulty and an awful lot of hardship for individuals getting their pay cut and getting bumped around the place. But we lived with it in order to ensure that there was no compulsory redundancies. And I'm proud of that. I'm very proud of it. And in fact, anybody listening to this podcast and they're in the private sector, I would say join a union, because they will provide you with the best opportunity of doing something similar if there's a problem in your employment.
One last point, and I won't detain you any longer, but you mentioned, and I think you said you were familiar with the Department of Social Welfare and how new technology has been brought in there. I think, now you probably know that department better than I do, but I think it's largely analogous with the home insurance market, which I know quite well. And in the past, say, 20 years, computerization and improved telecommunications have absolutely transformed the retail insurance market, such that the amount of activity per worker has gone through the roof. Probably for one employee, you're dealing with maybe 4 or 5 times more business per employee. You said that there's been significant computerization in the Department of Social Welfare. Has the amount of activity per employee increased with that?
Well, first of all, it was a historical point about going back to when the first time I came across the intranet.
Sure, but the bottom line is how much has the headcount gone down because of that technology?
Well, in fact, the headcount went up very little in the Department of Social Protection in the recession, despite the fact that there was an explosion in the number of, I hate to use the word given the department, but clients is the word that they often use themselves. And there was as you know, unemployment went through the roof very, very quickly. And in a department that, in addition to having to deal with unemployment, also pays pensions and all that sort of thing, pays in fact out 1 million people a week. But the numbers
it's
went up
to the insurance industry, isn't it?
The number, well, I'm not entirely sure that it is, but I'm not going to have that debate because it's irrelevant to the point I'm going to make.
Go ahead.
The numbers went up comparatively little, in fact, over the course of the period from 2009 till now, even though there was this mass explosion. And obviously, look, that could not have happened unless that department had adapted its systems, not just its technology systems, but also the way in which it dealt with people. And the other thing it did as a consequence of the explosion in unemployment is it changed its focus a lot. So that not just did they continue just paying people every week, which is the kind of core activity of the department, but they started trying to provide services to the unemployed to try and get them back into the workforce. But that was possible. All of that was possible, and the manpower was available to do it simply because they'd adapted their systems. But you would expect them to do that, and this is really the point I'm making. This kind of simplistic notion that there's inertia in the public service and that there's some sort of vibrant private sector out there to which it could stand or to which it should be subjected to unfavourable comparison is absolutely invalid. There is no substance to it at all. It's based largely on a kind of a prejudicial, simplistic view of what goes on in a multi-organisational part of our economy, which is called the public service.
Okay, just one last quick question. The unemployment rate in Ireland has halved since about 2012, so in the past 5 years. How much has the headcount gone down?
Well, the refocus of the department actually is now beginning to show positive effects because the numbers
I'll
of
take
people.
That as a zero.
The numbers of people that were in the course of the recession that were turned away from the task of just simply paying people every week to trying to get them back into the workforce, to trying to provide them with training and all of that, that is now beginning to bear fruit because that resource is now available to the department.
I won't press you on that anymore. Tom Geraghty, the General Secretary of the Public Service Executive Union. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks very much, Wim. Take care.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
In case you didn't notice, I didn't agree with everything Tom Geraghty was saying. His job is to advocate for his members, so that's fair enough, but I want to check if what he was saying is valid. I don't like to get too deep into statistics, because I don't think that works well in an audio format, but I want to take up a few things that Tom said, so bear with me. If you take the real boom from about 2000 to about 2007, revenue, that's the tax take, went up from about 30 billion a year to almost 50 billion a year. And then in 2008, 2009, it crashed back down again, almost all the way back down to 30 billion a year. In the same time, 2000 to about 2007, government spending, which is mostly wages, shot up along with it. Remember Charlie McCreevy saying, "When I have it, I spend it"? Well, he really did spend it. But what he had was once-off tax revenue from the housing boom. And what he spent it on was salaries that would have to be paid every year, boom or no boom. When the crash came, all those people who had been hired and given big pay rises, they still had to be paid, but that huge boom in revenue on the back of the property market had stopped. That created a huge annual deficit, every year clocking the national debt higher and higher. Now, people will say, what about bailing out the banks? And they're right. Bailing out the banks cost a vast amount of money, about 70 billion euro. A lot of that will be paid back by selling bank shares, but the final cost will be about 40 billion euro. But continuing to pay boom-level salaries through the financial crisis meant borrowing more than 10 billion euro a year, every year. That borrowing clocks up and overspending $10 billion a year very quickly outstrips a once-off cost of $40 billion. Now, Tom says that he's looking for the pay cuts to be reversed, but there is some vocabulary there that I think is a bit slippery. It's true that the public sector workers had pay cuts, technically, but they also had pay increases, even though they didn't call them that. In the public sector, there are 3 ways to get a pay increase. The first one is a pay increase, just like everyone in the competitive sector might get. But in the public sector, there's also what are called increments. These are automatic pay increases, usually every year, and they're written into the job description. Now, most people would regard anything that gave them more pay as a pay increase, but that's not the way the public sector unions see it. And that's how a great many public sector workers, who technically had a pay cut, ended up within a year or two with having a higher salary than they had before the pay cut. And that's the reason why, despite the pay cut, the public sector pay bill went up every single year throughout the crash, although the speed of its increase did slow down. And as well as what the unions call pay increases and the increments, when someone in the public sector gets promoted, they get a pay increase for that as well. They're put onto a higher increment scale. And that increase is excluded from what the unions calculate as pay increases as well. Tom also said that there needed to be a wider tax base to pay for the increases that he's looking for. That's tax increases to you and me. I'm going to have a look at what value for money is on offer for those tax increases in the next podcast.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
And that's almost the end of episode 60 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 2nd of May 2017. I have references to most of the things I was talking about in the show notes for this episode on the website. And one new feature that I mentioned before, there's a lot of people who don't necessarily have iPhones, who don't use podcast software, just listen on the website. So you can now go on the website, submit your email address, and get an alert each time a new podcast comes out. I promise I won't use it for anything else. Just enter your email and you get one simple email with a link to click and listen to each new podcast. No spam, I promise. If you can think of a topic that should be covered in a future show, or if you want to suggest someone to include, and that could be yourself, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a rating or even write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, follow the podcast on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and subscribe to the podcast so new shows automatically come up in your feed. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software, or subscribe by email now as well. There's full information about all of that and contact details for the show all at www.here'show.ie. The next show will be uploaded shortly. Hopefully I won't be so stuffed up. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.